Elon Musk's quest to unmask what happened at Twitter before he took over continues apace, and it is fascinating. Over the weekend, he revealed two more tranches of Twitter files, one via Matt Taibbi, the former Rolling Stone journalist, the other via Michael Shellenberger, the former Democrat who has been disillusioned with a lot of the sort of extremist global warming talk. The thread from Matt Taibbi really sets the stage for the thread from Shellenberger. And I have to say, the rollout of this stuff, just from a PR angle, is very, very smart. They're rolling it out on Twitter, which is where most of the coverage is going to be. Not only are they doing it that way, they're also doing it serially, which means that people are really keeping an eye as more headlines emerge about how Twitter was run. So the first thread from Matt Taibbi is about the removal of Donald Trump circa October 2020 to January 6th. The idea is that the preconditions for removing Trump were set from October 2020 to January 6th. And what they show is ad hoc decision-making at the highest level of Twitter. Outside of Jack Dorsey. Jack Dorsey was off doing what he does, like hanging out with malaria-ridden mosquitoes in a Malaysian cave or something. And the rest of the Twitter infrastructure was basically playing while Dorsey was gone. They were deciding who should stay, who should go. They were using their own political predilections to decide what sort of material was worthy of being seen. And they set all of these preconditions in spite of the fact that they knew that there was no actual hardcore policy that was being defined by Twitter. They knew that there was no actual standard that was being set by Twitter. Instead, they just basically decided, here's the thing I don't like. How do I cram this square peg into the round hole of Twitter policy? So here is what Matt Taibbi says. Again, this is covering the period October 2020 to January 6th, just before Donald Trump was banned from Twitter. And all of this is really important, not just because of what Twitter was during the election of 2020, although that's important, obviously, but because this is how big tech is run. And for so many of us who get our information via the outlets that big tech provides, you have to understand that there is a thumb on the scale in nearly all of these cases. This is not just a Twitter problem. This is a Facebook problem. This is a YouTube problem. This is something that we've been experiencing as a company, Daily Wire, really since we began, is the vagaries of how these big tech platforms work. You'll be running a company and suddenly you'll see a 40% drop in traffic in like a week because Facebook has quote unquote changed its algorithm. And the question you have to ask yourself is, are they changing the algorithm broadly and is it affecting everyone, or are they just targeting me? And because they're not transparent about how these platforms are run, there is really no way to tell until you just, through trial and error, try to rebuild your business. Well, meanwhile, over at the New York Times, it doesn't seem like they're experiencing anything remotely like the same problems in terms of having to navigate these wilds. Instead, it seems like they're doing a pretty good job of having the inside track on exactly how this information is being distributed. The big tech companies work in tandem with legacy media and the Democratic Party, as well as, it turns out, sometimes members of the FBI, in order to quash particular stories, in order to reduce the amount of information that is spread that they don't like you to see. So here's what Matt Taibbi writes. This came out December 9th, so it would have been Friday night. Quote, "The world knows much of the story of what happened between riots at the Capitol on January 6th and the removal of President Donald Trump from Twitter on January 8th. We'll show you what hasn't been released. The erosion of standards within the company in the months before January 6th, decisions by high-ranking executives to violate their own policies, and more against the backdrop of ongoing documented interaction with federal agencies." So there are several of these threads that went out. There was the Taibbi thread, and then there was the Shellenberger thread. And then a Barry Weiss thread is set to emerge in short order. Taibbi says, whatever your opinion on the decision to remove Trump that day, the internal communications at Twitter between January 6th and January 8th have clear historical import. Even Twitter's employees understood in the moment it was a landmark moment in the annals of speech. He says, as soon as they finished banning Trump, Twitter executives started processing new power. They prepared to ban future presidents and White Houses, perhaps even Joe Biden. The new administration said one executive will not be suspended by Twitter unless absolutely necessary. Twitter executives removed Trump in part over what one executive called the quote-unquote context surrounding actions by Trump and his supporters over the course of the election and, frankly, the last 4+ years. In the end, they looked at a broad picture, but that approach can cut both ways. In other words, there was no actual standard that was being applied. They just didn't like what Trump had done over the past 4 years, and they didn't like the result on January 6th. And therefore, they decided that even though Trump had not actually violated a policy, Trump had to be banned. Taibbi says the bulk of the internal debate leading to Trump's ban took place in those 3 January days, January 6th to January 8th. However, the intellectual framework was laid in the months preceding the Capitol riots. Before January 6th, Twitter was a unique mix of automated rules-based enforcement and more subjective moderation by senior executives. As the election approached, senior executives, perhaps under pressure from federal agencies with whom they met more as time progressed, increasingly struggled with rules. They began speaking of bios as pretext to do what they'd likely have done anyway. After January 6th, internal Slack showed Twitter executives getting a kick out of the intensified relations with federal agencies. Trust and safety head Yoel Roth, who's emerging in all of this as a real villain, lamented a lack of generic enough calendar descriptions to conceal his very interesting meeting partners. Again, this is all in the internal Slack channels that have now been revealed by Elon Musk via Matt Taibbi. So, for example, Yoel Roth wrote after January 6th that he's a big believer in calendar transparency, but he's taking so many meetings with high-level government officials that now he doesn't have calendar transparency that is opaque enough. And so he's just taking stuff off the calendar. He says that he's meeting about Trump, pretty obviously. And then he says, definitely not meeting with the FBI, I swear, which of course is him being sarcastic. Matt Taibbi says, these initial reports are based on searches for docs linked to prominent executives whose names are already public. They include Yoel Roth, former Trust and Policy Chief Vijaya Gadde, who you'll remember went on Joe Rogan and said shadow banning was not occurring, and recently plank-walked Deputy General Counsel and former top FBI lawyer Jim Baker. One particular Slack channel offers a unique window into an evolving thinking of top officials in late 2020 and early 2021, says Taibbi. On October 8th, 2020, executives opened a channel. Through January 6th, this particular channel was the home for discussions about election-related removals, especially ones that involved high-profile accounts they called very important tweeters, VITs. There released some tension between safety operations, which is a larger department whose staffers were using rules in order to ban, for example, porn or scams or threats, and a smaller, more powerful cadre of senior policy executives like Roth and Gadde. The latter group were a high-speed Supreme Court of moderation issuing content rulings on the fly, often in minutes, and based on guesses, gut calls, even Google searches, even in cases involving the president. During this time, executives were also clearly liaising with federal enforcement and intelligence agencies about moderation of election-related content. While we're at the start of reviewing the Twitter files, we'll be finding more about these interactions every day. Policy Director Nick Pickles was asked if they should say Twitter detects misinformation through ML, human review, and partnerships with outside experts. The employee asks, I know that's been a slippery process. Not sure if you want our public explanation to hang on that. Pickles says, can we say partnerships? After a pause, he says, not sure we describe the FBI or Department of Homeland Security as experts. They're partnering with all of these places to crack down on quote-unquote election misinformation. Apparently, one post about the Hunter Biden laptop story showed that Yoel Roth not only met with the FBI and the DHS, but also with the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. Roth's report to the FBI and DHS and DNI is almost farcical in its self-flagellating tone. Quote, we blocked the New York Post story, then unblocked it, but said the opposite. Comms is angry. Reporters think we're idiots. In short, FML, F my life. Some of Roth's later Slacks indicate his weekly confabs with federal law enforcement involved separate meetings. Again, there's all sorts of material here showing that Yoel Roth was essentially working with the FBI to determine what should be banned and what should not be banned, which looks a lot like violation of First Amendment issues, at the very least. Examining the entire enforcement Slack, says Matt Taibbi, we didn't see one reference to moderation requests from the Trump campaign, the Trump White House, or Republicans generally. We looked. They may exist. We were told they do. However, they were absent here. In other words, it was just coming from the Democrats and it was coming from members of the FBI. Okay, so that was part one that was sort of released over the weekend. Part two that was released over the weekend was the Michael Schellenberger portion. This is Twitter Files Total Part 4, because there's originally a Taibbi thread, then a Barry Weiss thread, then another Taibbi thread, and now a Michael Schellenberger thread. And this one gets really juicy. So now we get to the actual removal of Donald Trump on January 7th. Schellenberger says, as the pressure builds, Twitter executives build the case for a permanent ban. On January 7th, senior Twitter executives created justifications to ban Trump, sought a change of policy for Trump alone, distinct from other political leaders. You know, what we would call sort of ex post facto laws, right? Bills of attainder, where you just decide this guy needs to go. Let's create a rule that allows us to go after this individual human being. And says Michael Schellenberger, the senior Twitter executives expressed no concern for free speech or democracy implications of a ban. So here's what he says. He says, for years, Twitter had resisted calls to ban Trump. Blocking a world leader from Twitter, it wrote in 2018, would hide important information and hampered necessary discussion around their words and actions. But after the events of January 6th, the internal and external pressure on Twitter CEO Jack Dorsey grew. Former First Lady Michelle Obama, tech journalist Kara Swisher, the ADL, high-tech VC Chris Sacca, and many others publicly called on Twitter to permanently ban Trump. Dorsey was on vacation in French Polynesia the week of January 4th to 8th, 2021. He phoned into meetings, but also delegated much of the handling of the situation to Yoel Roth, Twitter's global head of trust and safety, and Vijaya Gadde, the head of legal policy and trust. So again, these are kind of the two leading villains in the Twitter saga. Jack Dorsey was an absentee landlord. He basically created the company, and then he decided he didn't like running the company, and he would run off on vacation, and he would leave Yoel Roth, who's a partisan hack, in charge, and Vijaya Gadde, another partisan hack, in charge. Schellenberger says, as context, it's important to understand Twitter staff and senior executives were overwhelmingly progressive. In 2018, 2020, and 2022, 96%, 98%, 99% of Twitter's staff's political donations went to Democrats. In 2017, Yoel Roth tweeted there were actual Nazis in the White House. In April 2022, Roth told a colleague his goal is to, quote, drive change in the world, which is why he decided not to become an academic. On January 7th, Jack Dorsey emailed his employees saying Twitter needed to remain consistent in its policies, including the right of users to return to Twitter after a temporary suspension. After, Roth reassured an employee that, quote, people who care about this aren't happy with where we are. Around 11:30 p.m. Pacific time, Roth DM'd his colleagues with news that he is excited to share. Quote, guess what, he says, Jack just approved repeat offender for civic integrity. The new approach would create a system where 5 violation strikes would result in permanent suspension. Progress, exclaimed a member of Roth's trust and safety team. The exchange between Roth and his colleagues makes clear they'd been pushing Dorsey for greater restrictions on the speech Twitter allows around election. The colleague wanted to know if the decision meant that Trump could finally be banned. Roth said it didn't. He says Trump continues to just have his one strike. Again, this is on January 7th. He was banned on January 8th. Roth's colleagues' query about incitement to violence heavily foreshadowed what would happen the following day. On January 8th, Twitter announced a permanent ban on Trump due to a, quote, risk of further incitement of violence. On January 8th, Twitter said its ban is specifically based on how Trump's tweets are being received and interpreted. But in 2019, Twitter said it did not attempt to determine all potential interpretations of content or its intent. Again, that is a very, very loose standard. Literally any tweet can be taken by some crazy person as impetus to do something bad. This is one of the things about public speech. There are lots of people who are listening to public speech, and many of them do crazy things. So, of course, you can't hold people accountable for what somebody takes into their brain and then spits back out in the form of garbled nonsense. Schellenberger says the only serious concern we found expressed within Twitter over the implications for free speech and democracy banning Trump came from a junior person in the organization who was tucked away in a lower-level Slack channel known as the Site Integrity Auto. This person wrote, it might be an unpopular opinion, but one-off ad hoc decisions like this that don't appear rooted in policy are a slippery slope. This now appears to be a fiat by an online CEO with a global presence that can gatekeep speech for the entire world. Twitter employees use the term one-off frequently in their Slack discussions. Its frequent use reveals significant employee discretion over when and whether to apply warnings on tweets and strikes on users. Again, it's pretty obvious that Twitter has been doing this for years, that they control visibility or they issue suspensions based on sort of an ad hoc decision-making process where progressive Democrats with blue hair decide whether you get to speak or not, or whether you get to see somebody else's speech. Twitter's employees recognize the difference, says Schellenberger, between their own politics and Twitter's terms of service, but they also engage in complex interpretations of content in order to stamp out prohibited tweets, as a series of exchanges over the hashtag #StopTheSteal hashtag reveals. So if something started to trend, right, a hashtag they didn't like, they just quash the hashtag, or they start hiding tweets to prevent the algorithm from elevating that particular hashtag. You could see this all the time, by the way, the manipulation of the Twitter trending items. Roth immediately DM'd a colleague to add that they add "Stop the Steal" and "Kraken" to a blacklist of terms to be de-amplified. Roth's colleagues objected that blacklisting "Stop the Steal" risks de-amplifying counter-speech that validates the election. Indeed, notes Roth's colleague, a quick search of top "Stop the Steal" tweets is counter-speech, is against the Stop the Speech movement, but it didn't matter. They ended up trying to block it anyway. We're in a battle for the culture and for our values. Like and subscribe to help keep our videos on the front line of the fight and top of your feed.